Hi, I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. So we're all familiar with the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer, one of the largest and most imposing ships in the Imperial Navy. But there are many other ships in the Imperial Navy that don't get nearly as much screen time as this iconic, imposing vessel. So today I figured we'd take a look at the ships that don't quite get the limelight, the smaller Imperial ships that really almost play as big of a role in the Navy as the ISD. But before we get into that, if you enjoy what you see here today, head down below and hit that subscribe button. I upload at least twice a week, covering everything from Star Wars to Halo to Fallout. Also, for regular viewers, I'm trying out a new format today, so this video will be longer than past videos. So as I mentioned before, the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer, or ISD, is one of the most iconic ships in the Imperial Navy, and probably the first thing that comes to mind when I mention the Imperial Navy from Star Wars. Today we're going to look at the ships that are smaller than the ISD. These are ships that play crucial roles in the Empire's ability to function as a galactic power. Before we go on, I should add that many of these small ships are specialized vessels, so they fill very specific roles in the Imperial Navy. So let's start out with the smallest of these ships, and that is the Gozanti-class cruiser. At 63 meters long, it's by far the smallest thing you could reasonably consider a capital ship in the Imperial Navy. And it can only really be called a capital ship under very loose definitions. It ends up serving a few very specific roles. While it is not very heavily armed or armored, it does make a very nice freighter or transport. We see it used to haul Imperial materials for constructing the Death Star, for example. But more notably, we see it carrying heavy Imperial equipment down to the surface of a planet. It's capable of deploying 2 AT-ATs or 2 AT-STs. On top of that, it can carry a very small fighter contingent, specifically 4 TIE fighters. When it comes to weaponry, it's not very well armed and is mostly dependent on any TIE fighters it may carry for defense. However, there are a few specialized variants of it. We do see a reconnaissance variant of it used to listen into Rebel transmissions, for example. One more interesting tidbit about the Gozanti is it was actually used by the Separatists during the Clone Wars. But the Gozanti wasn't the only small ship. Moving up the scale, we get to the Arquitens-class light cruiser. At 325 meters in length, the Arquitens-class cruiser is significantly larger than the Gozanti. But like the Gozanti, it is also a holdover from the Clone Wars. The Arquitens-class light cruisers served the Republic during the war. In fact, during the war, it was so attached to operations carried out by the Jedi, it gained the nickname the Jedi Light Cruiser. Unlike the much smaller Gozanti, the Arquitens actually is a proper warship. Its significantly larger size gave them the ability to add things like turbo lasers, which made it a much more effective vehicle at ship-to-ship combat. I would in many ways say the Arquitens is sort of similar in caliber to a Corellian corvette, like a CR-90 or something. For its small size, it was actually a fairly well-rounded ship, having laser cannons and turbo lasers, making it a nice patrol vessel for fleets that are too small to really need an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. As a result, small fleets of Arquitens would be a common sight in the Outer Rim, notably in systems that were not strategically important enough to necessitate the presence of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. When serving without a Star Destroyer, the Arquitens could serve as a command ship as well as a flagship for small fleets, a role it performed rather well. It would also be seen in a few occasions escorting some of the larger ships, which I will mention a little later on in this video. Most of the Arquitens' roles would end up being combat or command roles, which were fitting to the ship's sort of well-rounded nature. It's not quite as specialized as any of the other small vessels that the Empire uses. Now, one of the vessels that would commonly be escorted by Arquitens-class light cruisers is the next vessel on our list, and that is the Quasar class carrier. Now, unlike the Arquitens, the Quasar class carrier is actually incredibly specialized. As its name suggests, it is a carrier. It is designed to carry large numbers of Imperial starfighters. We see them used on screen as sort of mobile air bases, pretty much what you'd expect from a carrier. The Imperials would park this in orbit of a planet that was not necessarily important enough to necessitate the presence of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, and then they could use things like bombers from this carrier to bombard ground targets. Due to its highly specialized nature, it wasn't quite as well armed or armored as something like the Arquitens, so it was normally escorted by 1 or 2 Arquitens-class light cruisers. Luckily, it's not completely defenseless without an escort. Seeing as it is a carrier, it would likely have a contingent of TIE fighters on board. As one would expect, these TIE fighters would obviously be fairly useful at engaging Rebel starfighters that were attacking the carrier. Notably, this is one of only a few Imperial ships that we could consider capital ships that we actually see stolen by the Rebel Alliance. At least that we see stolen on screen. After one of these ships was stolen by the rebels over Ryloth, it was renamed Phoenix Nest and used as a base for most of their fighter craft, a role that unsurprisingly this Quasar Fire class carrier was well suited for. Like the Arquitens and the Gozanti, the Quasar Fire would serve until the fall of the Empire and then would sort of disappear into galactic history after the Empire's collapse. But so far, all of these ships that I've mentioned basically fill roles that could be filled by an Imperial-Class Star Destroyer were one sent to one of these systems. The next ship on our list is one whose role can't be filled by an Imperial-Class Star Destroyer, and that is the experimental Interdictor-class cruiser. Now, the Interdictor cruiser is significantly longer than any of the other ships I've mentioned on this list, at about 1,100 meters. And unlike many of the other ships, it actually does very much resemble an Imperial-Class Star Destroyer. But there are a few very significant differences that really set it apart from the ISD. You see, the Interdictor is not very well armed or armored. What it does have is 2 pairs of gravity well generators. What these do is they allow the Imperials to basically sever hyperspace routes. The way hyperspace works, when you're jumping, if your hyperdrive detects a gravity well, it pulls you out of hyperspace. So these gravity well generators generate gravity wells that prevent ships from jumping to hyperspace or can pull ships out of hyperspace. This is devastating against the Rebel Alliance because they like using hit-and-run tactics. Their ships, usually starfighters, jump into a system, carry out a strike against an Imperial target, and then jump out of the system before the Imperials can muster enough of a force to respond. Now, understandably, this whole plan is thrown into chaos when an Interdictor is present and they are not able to jump out of the system. What this does is it forces rebel forces to engage the Imperial forces that are present. In most situations, this would end up pitting a small rebel fleet against a much larger Imperial force. But of course, their gravity well generators aren't the only things the Interdictor has packing. It also does have a small number of turbo lasers and laser cannons. On top of that, like most other Imperial ships around its size, it does have a ventral hangar bay. This hangar bay, located on the bottom of the ship, like most Imperial-class Star Destroyers, would probably be filled with TIE fighters and other interceptors as well to help deal with threats to the ship. Unlike the other ships on this list, the Interdictor actually does usually function in fleets with Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Its very specific role means it adds a value to an Imperial battle group that wouldn't normally be provided by the ISD. As such, on a few occasions we do see them operating along with Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Luckily for the Rebel Alliance, the Interdictor was experimental, and didn't see very wide deployment throughout the duration of the Galactic Civil War. But on the few occasions where it was deployed, it was a major thorn in the side of the Rebel Alliance forces. So that is only a few of the smaller vessels in the Imperial Navy. These are the ones that come to mind when I think of small vessels. These all make notable appearances, by the way, in Star Wars Rebels, if you want to see more on where these ships pop up. And if you want to know what happened to the Imperial Navy, or the Empire as a whole, after the Battle of Endor, I actually have a video on that. I will leave a link up in one of the corners to my video on the fall of the Empire, specifically comparing it in Legends and canon. And I want you to tell me 2 things in the comments down below. First things first, do you want to know more about one of the ships I talked about today, or do you have a ship that I didn't mention that you feel like should be here, or just want to know more about in general? Leave them down in the comments and I'll try my best to get around to it. And also, if you're a regular viewer or a new viewer, tell me what you think of this longer video format. Is it too long, or do you like me rambling a little bit more and getting a little bit more in depth on the things I'm talking about? And if you enjoyed what you saw here today, don't forget to head down below and hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.